Our AI future has been written by just two men, Sam Altman and Demis Hassabis. That's one of the opening lines from a new book about AI called Supremacy, and it's a book that chronicles how Sam Altman, arguably the human face of AI, began as an idealistic, hopeful leader who had a vision of a non-profit project that could develop AI for the good of humanity, as did Demis Hassabis, the co-founder of DeepMind. And then how both of these projects were forced to change, to evolve, to compromise, to seek profits. And they are now essentially part of the big tech monopolies. How will that affect the development of AI? How will that change the risks? How will that affect the world? How does it affect you? We'll explore all of this and more on today's episode of AI Curious. My name is Jeff Wilser. I'm a journalist, I'm a human, and I'm curious about AI. And I was insanely curious about a book that just came out called Supremacy: AI, ChatGPT, and the Race That Will Change the World. The author is Parmy Olson, a technology columnist at Bloomberg and former reporter at the Wall Street Journal and Forbes. The book Supremacy has gotten a ton of glowing reviews and has just been shortlisted for the Financial Times Business Book of the Year award. The book essentially is about this evolution of OpenAI and DeepMind, which is now owned by Google. And it's really, at heart, a character study about the evolution of these two men, Sam Altman and Demis. Parmy's book, Supremacy, tells a story that really does read like a Hollywood blockbuster. Over a decade ago, both Sam and Demis started out trying to build super advanced AI in a non-profit way that could help solve really big problems, like solve climate change, cure cancer. And they wanted to do it in a way that was not driven or warped by profits. Her reporting shows how these two rivals were then forced to make for-profit compromises, and then explores how this could cause sneaky, surprising, subtle harms to society. So for today's episode, I am delighted to welcome the author of Supremacy, Parmy Olson, and we get into all of this. It's essentially a two-act story. In Act 1, Parmy walks us through the early days of both Sam and Demis, explaining their wide-eyed optimism and then how this shifted and what happened and why it happened. In Act 2 of our conversation, we get into the why this matters of it all. And to clarify, I am not someone who thinks just because a company is for profit, they are therefore evil. And I'll go further. If we didn't have for-profit companies, the world would be far worse off, at least in my view. So I press Parmy on why this matters, and she gives some compelling, concrete reasons that essentially, given what's at stake, AI development really is different from your normal widget company. And I'll also note that this conversation and Parmy's book is insanely, almost hilariously topical. She traces the arc of how OpenAI shifted towards profit-seeking, and now, almost as we speak, OpenAI is officially trying to restructure itself as essentially a for-profit company. She was prescient. And AI regulation is a hot-button issue throughout the space, in large part because there are now only a handful of big tech companies that can afford the capital to build frontier models, including the two central players in Parmy's book, OpenAI and Google's DeepMind. I had a blast chatting with Parmy, and I do recommend her book. So with that, please enjoy my conversation with Parmy Olson, author of Supremacy. Parmy, welcome to the pod.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So I'd like to jump in with a juicy, provocative quote from the introduction of your amazing book. You write, "When you boil everything down, our AI future has been written by just two men, Sam Altman and Demis Hassabis." Can you give a top line of what that means, unpack that quote a bit, and then, of course, we'll get into the more details and the nuance.
Yeah. So that is a punchy line, I will say that. But I mean, it's kind of a bold statement to make. And it's kind of the crux of why I wrote the book, because when ChatGPT came out in late November 2022, I was in awe, like so many other people. I thought this is an incredible
Mm-hmm.
tool. It's so human like. And then I was thinking, this is coming from an organization that wants to build artificial general intelligence, OpenAI. That is their end goal. And but they weren't the first company to try to do that. There was a company that tried to do that earlier, which was Google's AI lab DeepMind. Since 2010 had been
Mm-hmm.
on this audacious quest to try to build human-like AI systems. And I thought, that's so interesting where we're at right now. And I think there's a lot going on behind the scenes that people don't know about. So, not only this quest, this crazy quest to build machines that are as intelligent as humans, but a rivalry between two really extraordinary visionaries, Sam and
Mm-hmm.
Demis. And that rivalry, it really was. These two men were the only ones really working on this, trying to build AGI with the funding to make it happen, potentially. That rivalry turned into an arms race between two large tech companies, Google and Microsoft, and they ended up becoming proxies for that corporate arms race. And that's where we are today. This, what had started as this humanitarian quest by these two men to build AGI to make the world a better place, had actually now turned into this corporate race, which is, I think, a lot of people who work in the tech industry would shrug their shoulders and say, well, that's what happens to every
That's the way
Silicon
it
Valley
goes. That's
company.
it's every tech industry story. Right, right, right.
And there's a phrase for that. It's called mission drift. You start off
Mm-hmm.
wanting to save the world, and then your mission becomes a bit more corporate. But what I thought was important, the reason I wanted to really drill down on that and explore the story behind that, is because AI isn't just any other technology. It's potentially very transformative in what it can do, and it could be woven into so many different parts of our society and our economic and business infrastructure. And this particular mission drift isn't just kind of interesting in and of itself, but as a phenomenon, we're also seeing a real growing power and influence among the companies who control this technology. And what I wanted to also explore, what was going on behind the scenes in the book, is this battle for control of the tech.
Mm-hmm.
Because both Sam and Demis knew or felt very strongly that they didn't want AGI, when they eventually built it, to be controlled by one company. And they both tried to create these governance structures to protect their technology, and they both failed. And I thought, that's quite telling, actually, that two key people in this race and in this industry and in this field were quite concerned about who controlled this technology and whether it would be controlled by tech giants, which is where we are today. So that's why I wrote the book, and that's kind of what the book is about. Hence the title Supremacy. It's about control and also governance.
Amazing. And we'll get into that. First thing I'll say is I hope you have the movie rights to this, because I can already see, I'm already doing the casting, wondering who's playing Sam and Demis, but I'm already, the Hollywood version of this, I'm already seeing it. It's great.
That'd be so
Okay.
cool.
So much to unpack there. And I think for listeners here, we're going to get into both the arc of a story as kind of evolution from these two extremely well-intentioned men. As you say, Parmy, it's hard to ask for better intentions at the beginning, and we'll get into how that evolves. And also, I think, in a way, more importantly, why that matters, how that could impact the average person, how that could impact the world, and then where we go from here. But let's start with the beginning. Let's start where you did. Let's start where, looking a million years ago, or 10, 14 years ago now, of Sam and Demis having these grand visions for AI. What were their original goals? Talk a little more about why they believed AGI could change the world. Where do they start from?
So, really, it started with Demis in 2010, 5 years before OpenAI was founded by Sam Altman. Demis Hassabis had just finished doing a PhD in neuroscience, and he wanted to start a company to build powerful AI systems. And the term AGI had only just really started to become commonplace. It was still very much a fringe theory. But he got
Hmm.
together with a couple of co founders who had this kind of electricity between the three of them. They really were excited about the prospect of building this technology, which, not just for the sake of it, but because when they reached the creation of AI systems that were as as cognitively capable as humans or more so, they had this belief that they could solve all sorts of social human problems.
What are some examples? What types
And
of problems were they
so
thinking they could solve?
so, for example, solve climate change
Hmm.
or cure all sorts of diseases or cure cancer. Demis
Hmm.
gave quite a number of interviews where he said that, yeah, when we reach AGI, we could eventually cure cancer. That was one that he actually touted quite a lot. Another one that was very personal to Demis was this idea of understanding the nature of reality and unlocking the
Mm.
mysteries of the universe. And some people I spoke to for the book mentioned that Demis actually had this quite strong religious slash spiritual background and even hoped along the way maybe discovering AGI would help him discover God. These were
Hmm.
some of the personal ambitions that he had. And it almost got to the extent that I remember speaking to a former manager at DeepMind who said in the early days, the executives would talk about whether they really needed to raise money in the next, because in the next few years they would reach AGI and the economy would be abolished. They wouldn't even need money anymore.
Wow.
So there was this sense that if they reached this threshold by creating this software, all sorts of problems would be solved. It was like humans didn't even need to solve those problems because we could offload it to this higher
It's
functioning
almost its own
digital
form of
consciousness.
religion in a weird way, like a tech
Mm.
utopia flavor of religion in its own stripe.
You're not the first person to have made that observation. And I think some people have said that about OpenAI's approach as well, that there people have this kind of ideological fervor around the building of AGI, that it represents this almost this utopia. This someone described it to me once as rapture for nerds. It's almost like a heaven that you're hoping to get to build one day, this ideal world through the building of technology. So those were the ideals,
Yeah.
the utopian ideals that Demis would talk about and believed seemingly within the company as well. And 5 years later, OpenAI came along in
Yeah,
part.
where was Sam? Can you give us a little some I'm visualizing in
Yeah.
your movie? We have the early Demis scenes.
Yeah.
What are the early Sam scenes? I think a lot of even casual listeners are of course aware of Sam Altman's in the news every day, right? They know him
Yes.
as
Yes.
not only the face of OpenAI, one would argue Sam Altman is literally the human face of AI at this moment, right? But I
Yes.
think a lot of folks
Yes.
don't really have much of a sense of what he was in his early days and origin stories. Tell like
Mm-hmm.
the listeners a
Mm-hmm.
little bit about Sam's early days. What was he doing before he had this full embrace of AI and open AI?
So, just in a contrast to Demis, who, by the way, was in the UK in London,
Mm-hmm.
Demis was like this scientist. He was a games designer. He was obsessed with games and a chess champion. Sam, who grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, and then went to Stanford in California and had his career and kind of coming of age in Stanford, was more of a networker. He was a
Mm-hmm.
popular guy at school. He was the head of all sorts of clubs. And when he came to Silicon Valley, he dropped out of Stanford to start a company. And he was one of the first startups at Y Combinator, which is the world's
Mm-hmm.
most successful startup accelerator. I mean, so successful. And that was a very important kind of luck in a way, not just
Hmm.
strategy on his part, but being part of that cohort meant that he was connected to some very deeply well connected venture capitalists and entrepreneurs and founders to be part of the first batch of YC founders. And he rose the ranks and started a company called Looped, which did moderately well and eventually had to wind down and wasn't seen as a big success. But somehow after selling his company, he took a year out, did some traveling, and then he ended up like investing some of his money into other startups and becoming an angel investor. And he just again used these really profoundly exceptional networking skills
Mm-hmm.
to connect himself deeper and deeper into the Silicon Valley network of entrepreneurs and VCs, and it became an advisor to Y Combinator, which of course he had been part of the first batch. And then eventually Sam was very good at engendering himself to figures of authority. When he was in high school, he would often go to the office of the principal and just sit down and shoot the breeze with the guy and
Who
talk to him
does
about
that?
his
Wow.
concerns. Yes, exactly. And I think Sam had a very similar relationship with Paul Graham, who was seen as this kind of big mentor for startups in Silicon Valley. They call him PG, and he was like a sage.
Hmm.
He would blog, and people would read his blog posts with this kind of reverence for every word that he said. And eventually, PG, aka Paul Graham, asked Sam to take over his role as the head of Y Combinator, and Sam did
Mm-hmm.
that. And that effectively made Sam one of the most powerful people in Silicon Valley because
Mm-hmm.
he had access to thousands of entrepreneurs and a network of many VCs who wanted access to those entrepreneurs. He himself was almost like a gatekeeper. He was getting inbound interest from VCs and founders wanting meetings either with himself or with other people. And so he just became this go to guy in Silicon Valley who just knew everybody. And on top of that, he was starting to become quite kind of painting himself as this wise figure of
Hmm.
startup among startups as well. And he would write blog posts just like Paul Graham did, giving advice to entrepreneurs, what to say at the kinds of things to talk about at dinner parties, or what the most important attributes of being a startup founder. Even though his own
Hmm.
startup had not been particularly successful, somehow he managed to portray and frame himself
Hmm.
as this kind of Yoda figure among startups, the next Paul Graham. And from that vantage point, he went on to found OpenAI in 2015 with Elon
And
Musk.
right, can you talk a little more about OpenAI's founding and Musk's involvement and what their original ideals were, and then we'll kind of link back the story to Demis and DeepMind and get to their struggles to try and stay this high-minded utopian AGI nonprofit focused projects, and then what ultimately, or I guess I won't use the word ultimate. We're still obviously in the early days. In the grand scheme of
It's
things,
not
we're
over
still
yet.
it's not
Yeah.
anywhere close to over. We're still early chapters, but at least our story so far. We'll get to the shift, but tell us a
Yeah.
little more about what your reporting indicated and what we know about Sam and Elon's kind of their original partnership and the other co-founders and what kind of goals at OpenAI were originally. And then we'll get to their first few years in DeepMind and what then happens.
Mm-hmm. So Elon Musk, by 2015, had already backed DeepMind. He had put money into that company. And when DeepMind sold to Google, Elon made a good return on that
Mm-hmm.
investment.
Mm-hmm.
But something about it really stuck in his throat. He didn't like the idea of Google having control of this really cutting edge research in AI. And he posted online a comment about how he had seen some really incredible things at DeepMind in terms of the research they were doing, and he was not comfortable with it. And so, one of the reasons he and Sam talked about starting OpenAI as a nonprofit was to act as a counterweight to
Mm-hmm.
Google.
Mm-hmm.
This notion that a single corporate entity with a profit motive was going to control whatever future AGI technology was produced was quite concerning
Yeah.
for Musk and
And
seemingly for
to
Altman too.
compartmentalize for a moment, whatever you, I mean, to state elephant in the room, whatever you think of Elon Musk at this moment in 2024, I think it's fair to say back in 2015, that seemed like a pretty laudable idea of having some counterweight to a corporate structure to develop this, as you point out, Parma, this tech that will have sweeping ramifications across the world. To have
Mm-hmm.
some nonprofits structured, have an organization that's a counterweight to
Mm-hmm.
Google, that seemed like a pretty good intent by Elon and Sam
Yes.
in those early days.
And without going on too much of a tangent, I would say that ever since then, Elon's become quite a bit more radicalized and red pilled. But back then, I think he was a bit more mellow and really
Yep.
truly believed in these noble ambitions. And Sam too. The thing is, we don't know what was going on inside their heads exactly and what motivated them. And part of me thinks that he with founding OpenAI with Sam, maybe he also just wanted to be ahead in this race. He wanted to be part of what was going to be quite a big development in technology, because by this time, big tech companies were starting to pay much more attention to AI. For many years,
Mm-hmm.
AI was just a kind of scientific backwater. But then in
Hmm.
2012, there was this annual ImageNet competition that Stanford was setting up, and there was quite a big jump in capability in deep learning models for vision recognition. And that got a lot of attention from companies like Facebook and Google. And Demis found that for the first time, big tech companies were trying to poach his own staff and offering
Mm-hmm.
them lots of money compared to what he could offer, which is one reason why he sold to Google. But
Mm-hmm.
going back to Elon, yes, AI was becoming a bigger deal. And so Elon then founded this organization with Sam to try and act as a counterweight to Google. And when they announced it in December, they actually said that we wanted to create this nonprofit that has no financial obligation, that is free from
Hmm.
financial obligation, and will create AI for the benefit of humanity. And so that was how they explained why they were a nonprofit.
My things have changed. Okay, so let's go there. Talk about the shift from that original nonprofit's ideal in parallel or I'm sure in the Hollywood, they'll fudge the timeline so it all seems to be happening in parallel, even though it's a little few years apart. But DeepMind and OpenAI both start with this idea to change the world for the better. They both are trying to shun profits. What were some of the pragmatic realities they bumped up against? Why you mentioned that Demis was getting
Yes.
talent poached away. And so I'm paraphrasing, obviously, shit. The only way I can stay viable, the only way I can keep developing AI in the way I want to, at the scale I want to get the AGI to help the world, to cure cancer, to help crack the problem of climate change, the only way we need capital. And we need
Yes.
Google's deep pockets. And
Yeah.
walk us through a little bit of that shift for both DeepMind and OpenAI. What were the struggles they faced and why they ultimately realized, whether we like it or not, save the world is going to save the shareholders.
Yes, exactly. And that's such a great summary of the situation. What you're touching on there is what ended up having to be these mental justifications that Sam and Demis had to make. We need to reach this goal, and the potential benefits are so big that we'll have to make some compromises along the way. And that is what happened to DeepMind in selling to Google. When they sold to Google, they managed to get Google to agree to let them have an ethics board
Mm-hmm.
to that would eventually steer legally have legal control over AGI. And actually, DeepMind had originally been approached by Facebook with an $800 million offer. And Facebook said no to the ethics board. And so DeepMind said no to Facebook. But Google said yes, they were offering less, 650 million. So DeepMind actually Demis left $150 million on the
Hmm.
table because having this ethics board was very important to him. And this
Mm-hmm.
proper governance of AI was important enough. Now, in the case of OpenAI, again, it came down to money. Starting off, there was a lot of pressure on staff at OpenAI to produce research that was as good as DeepMind's. And this was all coming from Elon Musk, because Elon kind of, again, started OpenAI as this kind of counterweight. And he was watching DeepMind. And DeepMind was getting some pretty good press for some of the milestones that they were achieving in AI, like the
Mm-hmm.
AlphaGo computer that was able to beat the world's best Go champion. This is like an Asian version of chess, but much more complicated and older. And so Elon was kind of measuring the success of OpenAI by how good they were versus DeepMind. But the problem was they needed money to build these models and to attract the talent that they needed, especially when Elon eventually left OpenAI.
Mm-hmm.
It got to a point where he was getting frustrated with the kind of research that they were turning out. He wanted to try and take control of the company. The board said no, and Elon left. As far as I understand from my reporting, Elon wanted to buy OpenAI in Tesla stock. It was a similar approach that he was going to use for DeepMind. He also tried to buy DeepMind, and DeepMind founders also said no. So that's another parallel there. But once Elon left, I mean, gosh, that just left Sam Altman and his team like really high and dry because that was their biggest benefactor. They were a
Mm,
nonprofit. They weren't taking investors, they were taking donations.
hmm
So they were going to people cap in hand, asking for money out of the goodness of their hearts to build this AGI. And the way that Sam framed AGI was that it would bring prosperity to humankind and elevate the wealth of everyone. And so that was his big dream for what it would do. But it was so expensive to build these models, and over time they realized they were going to have to actually change their structure from a nonprofit into something that could actually be investor friendly, so that instead of asking for donations they would ask for investments. And so the company eventually restructured itself as a capped profit company, which is this very convoluted Byzantine approach to sort of putting a nonprofit board in charge and then having investors get a capped level of profits from whatever returns they get. But it worked, and they were able to get $1 billion of investment from Microsoft, which was the thing that allowed them to keep going.
So both of these projects were forced to effectively shift to a more for-profit model. Actually, I'm curious, do you think that was inevitable? Did they have a choice there, or is there a world where they could have continued pursuing these high-minded ideals without literally selling out, without going the for-profit route?
I think in this current world that we live in, it would have been very difficult for them to continue on the path to actually do the development and the research to build more powerful AI systems without aligning themselves with large technology companies. In another world, I think you would need to have a completely different kind of economic system, which doesn't allow companies to amass so much power, which is something I get into later on in the book, the sort of
Mm-hmm.
consequences and just the state of play where we have six enormous tech companies who make up a huge chunk of the S&P 500, and they have just in market capitalizations that are in the trillions of dollars in aggregate. And I think that creates this kind of center of gravity that is very difficult to pull away from if you're a startup, if you're a very promising startup, especially. Just to quickly pivot into the current day, in this past year, three of the most promising AI startups have all been acqui-hired by big tech companies: Character AI,
Mm-hmm.
Adept, and Inflection. They all went to Google, Amazon, and
Mm-hmm.
Microsoft. And these were companies that had millions of dollars in funding and were very well resourced. But this is just the kind of direction that
Yeah,
things
so
go in.
let's go there. So, what are, yeah, and thank you for walking us down this journey. And I encourage listeners to check out Parmy's book that really, in a really lively, engaging way, brings us through this evolution of these two projects. Let's talk about the consequences of this, both with in terms of AI research and AI development, and then how you see this impacting society at large. What to you is most concerning about this for profit pivot these projects were forced to make?
Yeah. So being for profit in and of itself is not a problem. The problem is when the steering is coming from companies that are so large and influential and powerful. If you just look at our lives in a very simple way, just look at our lives today. It's like literally impossible to live your life as maybe a middle-aged or young person or even an older person without using a service or product from one of the largest tech companies. There's a
Mm-hmm.
really good article, which I highly recommend everybody read, by New York Times writer Kashmir Hill, back when she was at Gizmodo. And she did this diary where she spent a week trying to just live her life without interacting with Amazon, Google, or Facebook, or Apple, any of the big tech companies,
Mm-hmm.
or Microsoft. And it was a nightmare. She couldn't do anything because it meant she couldn't use companies that were hosted on AWS, which was Amazon. She couldn't do email. She couldn't use her phone. She had to use a brick phone. It was really difficult to travel places. In a way, we can't vote with our feet as consumers when it comes to using
Right.
this tech. It's
There's
just
no
our
Walton
infrastructure.
ponds we can go to. There's no
No,
Thoreau would have a tough go in 2024.
exactly. So it's just we have to take what they're going to give us, whatever that is, because they're utilities now, and that's also what makes them very difficult to regulate. But there are
But okay,
conveniences to that.
but for
Mhm,
listeners who are like, okay, you're saying that there's this big tech has this concentrated power, but how has it really hurt? I'm making it
mhm,
perhaps a straw
yeah.
man here, but how does it affect me? How, given that we do live in a capitalist society, given that this is the only realistic path forward for companies who do
Mhm,
want to create AI, that they do think AI still will have these tremendous benefits, including, and I'll confess, I'm personally optimistic on things like drug discovery. I do think there's all
mhm.
kinds of benefits for AI development, and that cannot happen without this for-profit framework for listeners who are like, okay, but what's the big deal? Why does this matter? What are the concerns? What are the pragmatic, concrete concerns that this is a problem? In your research, Parmy, and as you've explored this further, what's your kind of main response to those who yeah, I get it, it's for profit, but so what? What is the most important, compelling reasons of why we should all be concerned about this trends?
I think the reason to be concerned is because of the things that get neglected. So, the
Mm,
research into the potential harms that AI can cause. Um, I always turn back to social media. Social media did
mm,
really great things for us as a society. We're not all dead because of it, but we have had harms. There have definitely been a price. There's been a price to pay.
mhm.
So, mental health of teens and adults, misinformation, conspiracy theories, political polarization. These are just some of the side effects that we've had
Elections being
from,
effectively hacks
yeah,
thanks to polarization. Yes.
yes, yeah.
So,
And but then when you look at why that is, a big reason is because there just isn't enough investment going into content moderation or
mm,
going into preventing those kinds of harms from happening. Facebook knew that Instagram was causing teenage girls to feel bad about themselves. It knew all this stuff, but it didn't really
mhm.
invest in helping to prevent it because that's not its priority. And you can understand why. It's a company, it has a fiduciary duty to shareholders. Fair enough. But it's so big that is
Mm,
sucking up all the resources, including from resources that perhaps should be going to organizations in civil society, organizations like the AI Now Institute or Data for Black Lives or the Algorithmic Justice Leagues. These are all the companies that are, these are all the organizations that are trying to just look into the potential harms that technology can cause. The problem is they have very little funding. It's pennies
yeah.
compared to what the big tech companies literally, their funding is in the single digit millions if they're lucky. And again, so when I go back to my point about what's getting neglected, let's look at academic research. So,
Mm,
in the last decade or decade and a half, academic research into AI has become completely dominated by big tech companies. It steers the research. Just look at the top AI scientists to come out of academia in the last decade: Fei Li, Andrew
mhm,
Ng, Yan LeCun. Where have they all gone? They're all working
mm,
for tech companies, and they were the
mhm,
top scientists. And if you just look at research itself, there was a great study that came out in 2022 from the Mozilla Foundation, Stanford, a couple others, and they found that in the decade to 2019, big tech funding and affiliations in academic research for AI had tripled to more than 70% of all of those of their studies. So 70% of
wow.
academic AI studies either had funding from a big tech company or the academics themselves had some kind of dual role, which I see this a lot. Someone at New York University, for example, AI professor, oh, they've also got a job at Google. That's just really
Mm,
common. And
mhm,
so why does that matter? You might think, well, so what? Well, because how are the researchers measuring success of AI? They're measuring success based on how their funders measure success. So, for example, in tech companies, what makes good AI is big AI, capable AI, powerful AI. But success in AI isn't just about those things. There are also other things that AI needs to be good at. It needs to be fair, and it needs to be inclusive, and there needs to be elements of justice and human well-being baked into the design of these models. But that's not where the research is going, because
mhm,
that's not where the incentives lie. So
Mm.
I think, just to go back to your question, does this matter? At the end of the day, these companies are steering the technology that we're going to use. They're not putting enough investment into the areas to make it safe and to make it to impact our well-being in a positive way. And not only that, they're not being regulated. They're not being
Hmm.
properly regulated. They're self-regulating. And that makes them untouchable. And I think there's something quite unnerving about that, about companies that have so much influence, and literally there's nothing we can do about it.
To your point, there's also the issue that these are becoming increasingly less open, right? The more for profit it's
Mm-hmm.
become, it's now the biggest kind of obvious joke in AI that OpenAI is nowhere close to being open. Talk a bit about the concerns of AI developing and effectively in secret, it being a black box, and what are the possible consequences of that?
Yeah. So, and that's something that we've seen happen over the last few years. The word open in OpenAI is a complete misnomer now. OpenAI refuses to reveal the data that they used to train their models. DeepMind also, I've spoken to people there, and they've said that as soon as ChatGPT came out, there was actually more of a clamping down on the releasing of research. So if you were a scientist there, you had to go through many more hoops before you could release some of the AI research that you were working on. And so these companies have become more secretive, and that's a problem because if we want to scrutinize their models for elements of bias, and bias is such a real issue. And
Mm-hmm.
I'll give you an example of that in a minute. But if we want to scrutinize them for bias, you need third parties, you need access to those models and to that training data. And till today, these companies have not been allowing third party researchers to do that. For example, when DALL-E came out, which was the image generation tool from OpenAI, I remember interviewing Mira Murati, who just left OpenAI, by the way,
Mm-hmm.
but she was chief technology officer at the time. This was about a year and a half ago. And I was asking her about the way, if you typed CEO into DALL-E, you would get 12 images of white men in a suit.
Mm-hmm.
There were no women, there were no people of color. And I was just asking her about the gender aspect. And it's actually a really difficult problem that they're working on. She was saying that we had women in the data set, but the problem was so many of the images were sexualized because these
Mm-hmm.
were images of women that they had scraped from the internet. And we all know what's on the internet, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they had to take all those sexualized images of women out of their data set. But when they did that, they reduced the number of women. And I remember Mira saying we reduced it by quite a lot. So these are like problems that these companies are working through. This was not that long ago, and they're working on them pretty much on their own with and regulating themselves, and we can't really know how good the output is until we use these systems in the wild. We are literally the guinea pigs for these tools because they're not being audited by third parties. They are being self-audited.
Circling back to where we began, do you think there's any hope of reclaiming AI's original, more utopian vision, or are we stuck with this profit driven model? And then, follow up question, and tackle this however you'd like. What do you see as the way forward? Given where we are, given how we got here, is it regulation? What are the solutions that you would like to see to help mitigate these issues?
Yeah, I mean, the profit driven, like being driven by profit again is not a problem for me. It's just the size that these kind of duopoly, oligopoly, whatever you want to call it,
Mm-hmm.
monopoly, and the kind of practices that leads to. And I think right now we're just kind of stuck with that, and we have to work with that. We're not going to get to a point where AGI is going to abolish the economy like some of those executives at DeepMind thought, and it's going to solve everything. I think there's a little bit of naivety on the part of the people who are really behind this. Like, again, the two visionaries, Sam and Demis, like incredible, like charismatic, like really intelligent people, but also naive in a way to believe that they could build this technology that was, first of all, going to solve all these problems for humanity, but also that they could do this so independently without being pulled in by this giant squid that is
Hmm.
effectively big tech companies. So I think this is the world we live in, and we just have to make it work. And I think the way to make it work is just better regulation. And the good news is I think we're getting there, but very slowly. So, for example, right now, for the first time in years, we are hearing talk in antitrust circles about breaking up Google. Like real, like considered discussion about this that would have
Hmm.
sounded crazy a year ago. And the European Union's AI Act, I think, is a very promising piece of legislation. It's not perfect, but it's the most sweeping attempt at regulating AI. It hasn't fully come into effect yet, so we'll have to see over the next year how well it works out. But for example, I think it actually is better designed than the AI Safety
Can,
Act that's
can you
on
give a
Governor.
quick, sorry, can you give a
Yeah.
quick primer for listeners of the
Hmm?
2 or 3 most important bits of that European Act and when it goes into effect?
So, probably the most important aspect of this act is that it obligates companies who build AI to do risk assessments. Now, this is going to sound like utterly boring for people because this, first of all, regulation is such a dry topic, but this is about looking at the potential harms that your AI can cause and conducting the correct assessments to make sure that you've designed your tech in such a way that it's not going to cause those harms. And it requires an element of transparency, it requires an element of auditing. So, for example, and then certain potential harms are banned. Mass surveillance through facial
Hmm.
recognition, that is just not allowed. You cannot produce a product that does that in Europe, in the
Hmm.
European Union. Another one is emotion detecting AI. I have ChatGPT advanced voice on my phone, and I'm not sure why, because apparently it was not. Sorry, maybe I should go back on this. But in the EU, as far as I understand, ChatGPT with advanced voice is not
Right.
available
Yeah, my
because
understanding
that,
too. There's an
be,
emotional recognition
because it
element to that. Yes.
Yes, because it detects emotion. Now, there's an argument to be made that Europe is really falling back in AI advancements, but there's another argument to be made that do we really want technology that can potentially know our emotions enough that it could steer us towards a certain
And
emotion?
to connect the dots, just to just make for listeners, it's the idea is when I'm using voice
Mhm.
interaction with ChatGPT, their voice will pick up on the intonation of my voice. And if I'm
Mhm.
sounding sad, it will
Yeah.
then not be chippy. And if I'm sounding chippy, it will not be sad. It will try and kind of match my vibes. And to your
Yes.
point, that is essentially analyzing my emotions, which is forbidden in the EU's regulation.
And I think actually that's probably a reasonable red line to have, even though
Yeah.
that sounds really cool, because there's the tech itself it's fine. There's nothing wrong with the tech. It's about how it gets used. So just think about what happened on Facebook. The moment that Facebook tweaked the algorithm behind its news feed so that it really
Mm,
started to optimize for engagement, that's when we started to see a rise in misinformation and conspiracy theories and
mm.
polarization because the algorithm was now gamed towards getting people to just click on things, and they would click on things that often sparked outrage. And I wonder if we would see a kind of similar unintended consequence when AI systems are, maybe they're not optimized for engagement, but optimized for something else, for some kind of business purpose, perhaps. There could also be another kind of unintended consequence, and that gets into quite risky territory when an
Hmm.
AI model can recognize my emotions and actually be quite persuasive. That's, I think, one of the most powerful things about large language models is how persuasive they are. Not to go too far down a rabbit hole, but romantic companion bots are like huge. There are thousands and thousands of people who see AI chatbots as friends or as romantic companions because they're so good at empathizing and showing
I
people.
totally agree. And my pet sinister theory is that in the future, a new version of a cyber attack, like for malware for your computer, will be a manipulation emotion attack through AI
Oh,
companion, right? So I can see some
oh, that's
entity, whether a
interesting.
rogue
Yeah.
state or some bad actor deploying this like almost like a spy or a mole an Iago, like a Shakespeare reference, to manipulate you over time. I can see that being deployed.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's my dark
Social
Black Mirror thought.
engineering.
Yeah,
Social
exactly.
engineering
So
through AI. Yeah.
on that note, Parmy, as final question for you. Again, the book is recommended to everyone. Final question. One thing I struggle with myself is I will raise my hand as being optimistic largely about AI with serious concerns, considerations, and pauses, right? How are you balancing optimism with these concerns and critiques? And do you think there is a way forward, whether for listeners or the world, to have space both for optimism that AI will help solve problems and make our lives easier and do useful things, but also be developed in a non-terrible way? Or where are you in that, on that continuum? And or are you like, okay, I'm out of here, this is too problematic and we need to throw all the optimism out? How do you wrestle with that?
I think one of the byproducts of social media has been that we are so used to just getting a single certain answer for so many things. That's actually, and we forget that it's really okay to have two contrasting realities in your head at the same time, two answers. I'm actually, I think, quite close to you in agreement in terms of my outlook, which is that I think AI is going to do really incredible good things for society, particularly in healthcare and in education. But there's always a price to pay for every tech revolution, whether it was the desktop or mobile revolution or the internet or social media. All these things brought incredible conveniences and economic growth and opportunity, but they also came with a price. And often that price kind of relates to an erosion of the human experience or human values, which is a very squishy and nuanced and abstract thing. It's very difficult to measure, but you know it when you think about, I always go back to social media. Like when we just think about how social media has impacted how often, and maybe this is also down to the internet and technology itself and smartphones, but just how often we have face-to-face interactions with other people now. And like that, there's the issue of loneliness is a chronic problem now. Like there's like, I think 40 to 50% of people in the world count themselves as lonely to some extent. And American teenagers are spending way less time socializing face to face than they did 10 years ago. These are just normalized things and we accept them as just reality, and maybe we accept them as okay. But some of us will disagree and feel that we are giving up something that is actually quite valuable to us. So in the case of AI, maybe there will be other erosions of other values like human creativity. With you see the way AI is really taking hold in the creative industries, critical thinking. Look at education, like how many people are using AI now to write essays and just to think through ideas and do more than just brainstorm. And also human agency to some extent, maybe even human relationships. If AI companions really continue to grow at the current rate, and they're so agreeable and they're really good at just playing kind of like the ideal partner. This is what I've heard from people who study these bots. That might just make humans harder to relate to because humans aren't agreeable necessarily. They've got edges and they've got lots of rough edges. But I guess the broader concern again is that these changes are coming to us unregulated, and we do need those regulations to make sure that human well-being and human agency, that those things are protected. Because again, Sam and Demis, they saw that from the very beginning and they tried to put in the governance structures to protect the technology and to protect humans, but they failed. And so hopefully that failure won't continue.
Parmy, beautifully said. Thank you for helping us understand this nuance. Thank you for articulating what the price could be and helping us better understanding that price. And I fully agree. It's not black and white. It's not one or the other. It's a mix of all of these things. I think your book is a great job teasing it out. I encourage everyone to check it out. We'll have links to it in the show notes. Thanks again. Really enjoyed the conversation. Best of luck to you. Congrats on the book.
Thank you, Jeff. Great to be here, and thanks for having me.
Well, there you have it. Thanks again to Parmy Olson, author of Supremacy. Thank you to you, dear listeners. Hope you enjoyed the conversation. I am confident if you did, you will enjoy her book. There are links to it in the show notes. If this is your first time at AI Curious, Please subscribe, like, rate 5 stars, all that good stuff. We're at Apple, Spotify, YouTube, all the usual suspects. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.